Hi, good morning. Rosalind Gold with the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, NALEO Educational Fund. Again, I also want to thank you for your hard work and continuing to really work with some very challenging and thorny issues. I just wanted to comment on 3 items. First of all, we commend you for your moving in the direction of putting in an affirmative statement in the statute that there will be a formal program of outreach to applicants. We do understand that the BSA interpret it regulatorily as their obligation to do this, but again, we believe you need something more strong and more permanent in the regulations. As the commissioners are looking at what that statutory language should look like and who should have that responsibility, again, we would reiterate there are a lot of options available if upon discussions with the BSA or in your own judgment you decide it's not appropriate to confer that role to the BSA. You can, for example, require whatever entity does it to confer with, cooperate, consult with the BSA so that there's good coordination. That is certainly an option. You can, again, either formally provide a role for the current commission by basically making that a responsibility of the commission, or again provide an advisory committee kind of role for the current commission. So there's lots of ways you can accomplish many of the things we've heard the commissioners express through putting in a formal statutory requirement that some entity does that outreach. The second point that I wanted to make is that we've heard a lot of discussion about which things should be responsibilities of the commission, and as those discussions have proceeded, there seems to sometimes be a interplay between the issues of is there money available, should it be in the budget, and is it something just in terms of the role and responsibilities of the commission? Should the commission be doing it? We would just emphasize that if it is only a budget issue, we would ask the commission to, take Commissioner Baraba's approach of thinking of how do you really want to build this? So we would not want you to be reluctant to take on a responsibility that you think is appropriate because you're concerned about the solely concerned about the implications. We would recommend that if you think it's an appropriate responsibility for the commission to ask for the budgetary appropriate line item, because if you do not ask for that, you will not get it. And so that is just something I wanted to add with respect to your discussions about what is the role of the commission with respect to certain responsibilities. And then finally, we do feel it would be very helpful to have some kind of formal document that is your policy recommendations, short of statutory and short of regulatory. We think having that formal document will, first of all, be extremely useful to future commissions, but also useful to the public, and having something formal that has been agreed upon and has consensus just has a power that merely a best practices manual does not have. That doesn't rule out that you could also do best practices, but we do think some type of formal policy recommendation document would be very helpful.
Thank you. All right, seeing no one approaching the microphone, I'll bring the discussion back to the commission. Do you have enough information to work with on the draft map timing and noticing item?
And I think we'll tease out the issue of noticing versus comment period as well with that.
All right. Item number 9, I notice the category is not applicable.
And I have to say, some of these were kind of my best guess at these. I could easily have gotten things wrong, as I've already shown to be. So I'm assuming that's the case. It's not really.
All right, let's go on to item number 10 then.
Dependent care reimbursement. And I guess this is the sense that I got at the end of our discussion, but I don't know if Commissioner Columbus-Malloy or anyone else would like to kind of comment on where we are with that.
I'm sorry to interrupt, only because I have a little bit of a delay and I'm on the phone. But who concluded that item number 9 is not applicable or not within our authority? I don't know who drafted this.
Oh, that would be me. That's Commissioner DiGiulio. I guess I just thought that it wasn't. Well, I guess maybe it's not applicable. If we wanted to exclude it, I guess we could.
Correct. I had asked before Mr. Miller left, and I'm not certain if it got delegated to Ms. Johnston, and I wasn't sure. We did discuss the issue at the first occasion in which we were considering proposed amendments. We were looking at the last two sentences. But again, we are going into lunch hour. I don't know if we want to pick this up later, or if Commissioner, I'll leave that to your discretion. Otherwise, I'll go on and give the details what we were referencing. I wasn't sure when you took public comment if you were going to continue our discussion or if you were taking a lunch break per the agenda.
Let's go as far as we can, so let's go ahead and address this item immediately.
Okay, but what I was looking at is when we first discussed this issue, I had raised it 8252. I think it's G, the last two sentences. There had been some discussion among the commissioners regarding whether, given the present status of the Connerly lawsuit, we also had discussions of whether or not this was a possibility of the drafters attempting to amend Proposition 209. So I don't know if the commission, if the general consensus was to avoid consideration of any amendment to the last two sentences, or whether we would just leave that to the subject of litigation. So I wasn't sure what the consensus was, given that it's on this memo that I think Commissioner DiGiulio put together. I just want to make sure that, from my perspective, it is applicable, it is statutory, unlike what's on the handout, and it is within our authority, but I just wanted to make sure what the general consensus is of the Commission regarding this. I think that there are ways that it could be better drafted to avoid litigation such as a Connerly lawsuit, and I'm not up to date on where that case is at momentarily, but there's always a possibility that it could be rendered moot based on any potential amendment that we might make. For instance, if we had left out, frankly, the word states diversity could be left in there, and then you could exclude including but not limited to the racial, ethnic, geographic, or gender diversity. And probably avoid lawsuits such as the Connerly lawsuit, and probably not be in conflict with the present status of the law. Question is whether or not we want to go forward and do that. I had asked Mr. Miller to give us a legal opinion on that issue, and again, I think that some commissioners may have a difference of opinion regarding whether we should amend it, but that was raised, and I think it's within our purview to discuss and consider.
Commissioner Rea?
Jody, was your question to Kirk Miller an opinion as to whether this is in conflict with 209?
No, I think it was twofold, if I recall correctly. Commissioner and Chet, I believe, and maybe Commissioner Blanco, thought that there might have been an argument that this was the intent of the drafters. There was always an argument or a possibility that it was the intent of the drafters to amend Proposition 209. I think that's pretty far out there, but I think we had asked him to address that, then alternatively also to ask him that if we had removed the language, but not limited to racial, ethnic, geographic, and gender diversity, would it render the Connerly lawsuit moot? And then, and when that happens, basically you'd move, once the amendment took place, if the litigation was still proceeding, then the litigation would be rendered moot and it would be dismissed, and there'd be no further legal issue to adjudicate in the Connerly lawsuit. That's what I'd asked him to address, but I don't think that we got a memo on that issue.
Ms. Johnston?
In the Connerly action, there is a demurrer pending, motion to dismiss pending, on the grounds that it does not conflict with 209 because 209 applies to employees and this is to appointed officials. So at this point, that's set for hearing March 23rd, I believe it is. So we really don't know until then. The other question, which I think you forwarded to Mr. Miller, was what happens if the law changes. And just as a matter of jurisprudence, if the law changes in the midst of a lawsuit, the court considers the law currently in effect for purposes of dealing with that lawsuit. But depending on what happens with the motion to dismiss Connerly, this may become a non-issue.
Okay. Are you in line?
I don't know if I was in the queue. I'll yield to
Yes.
those who were in the queue earlier,
Okay.
but I'll say something.
Commissioner Forbes?
Jody, so do I understand you to say that we could delete the rest of the sentence after the commission reflects this state's diversity period, and then delete everything else?
I think it's something to consider.
Okay, just wanted to be sure I understood what you were suggesting.
Commissioner Bronco?
Yeah, I don't really see a need to change this. The papers we submitted make two arguments. One, that this doesn't apply to commissioners, that the language is clear that it's for state employees and contracts with the state and applicants to state universities and colleges. I think, and it's very strong. I mean, the case law is very strong in that regard. The other thing that we say in our case, in our pleadings, is that 209 only comes into play if you've given one individual a preference over another individual based on race. Nothing in the current language that we have here does that, and that's the other argument we make in our pleadings. Not only do we have a slate, which means you're not looking at individuals, but we look at a totality of things, and it's not like we base one person's selection and give them a preference over another selection. So I think the lawsuit, frankly, is weak. The one that was filed, and I don't see that. If people want to change it for other reasons, they could change this for other reasons. But I am not concerned of trying to do something to help defeat the lawsuit, because I think it's going to lose anyway. So whatever we do, it should not be based on trying to moot out the pending litigation. We should do it because we think there's something wrong with the wording as it stands now. And I personally think we're fine with the wording as it stands now.
I don't know if you have a queue, Commissioner Yout, because I can't watch the video, but I'd like to be in the queue next or whenever.
Commissioner, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you. In response to Commissioner Blanco, the purpose for considering amendment was not to render the lawsuit moot. That was one issue that came up in that regard. But I will take issue for a few things, but I will be cautious and conscientious of the manner in which I raised this issue because of the fact that the lawsuit is pending. I recognize, and more likely, that I think the demur will likely be successful. But the point overall that's made in the lawsuit is very good, and I think would apply regardless of whether or not you're a commissioner in this state, whether you're an employee, whether you're a private individual, from my perspective, even though it may not apply, obviously. The point is that when you actually segregate out that type of language, overall, it's something that we are trying to get away from in the United States and trying to get away from in the state of California. I don't find that there's a necessity for having racial, ethnic, geographic, or gender diversity identified in this statute or any other statute, which is precisely why I probably supported Prop 209 to begin with. So I think it does not need to belong here. So I think even in the spirit of the Connerly lawsuit, this could be, and this commission can consider removing it because we understand what the state's diversity in and of itself based on the regulations and the requirements that each commissioner needed to recognize diversity spells out, and you don't necessarily need it in this statute. The second issue that I would like to make based on your comments is that you were not there in December, and the lawsuit focuses on the selection of the next 6 commissioners following the 8. And whether or not there were quote-unquote preferences for race, I'll leave that to either a judge or a jury or the public to consider in watching our videos. But it is pretty clear that race did play a particular factor in the determination and the selection of the next 6 commissioners, and whether or not that should be done, and whether or not there's a higher preference in consideration of other categories and other requirements for a commissioner. Again, I'll leave that to someone else's determination, but it was done, and whether or not it should have been done is questionable. So I think when we want to look at the spirit of the Connerly lawsuit and apply it to us, then we could very well do without that additional language of race, ethnicity, geography, and gender, and still be within the spirit of selecting a diverse commission, but yet you don't need to do it based on preferences for race. And that's what my intent is, and not just to moot out a lawsuit.
Commissioner Incheta.
Obviously, this issue is one that has commanded a lot of attention in the public, and certainly there's clearly going to be disagreements within the commission as representatives of the citizenry of California. So, I mean, I will speak in favor of the language. I think it's important to have these characteristics within, among others, that should be within a definition of diversity within the state. I think the drafters of Prop 11 intended these to be in there because I think it's important. I think it's important. Again, I acknowledge that there's disagreements. I voted against Prop 209 for nobody cares about that. But I think I think it's worth talking about. I don't think we will necessarily change our minds given how we look at the issue of race and how it ought to be playing a role in public policy. I simply note that my personal preference is to leave the language in there.
Commissioner Forbes.
I've thought about this because I think your comment is not without some merit, Jody. But I think that characterizing the kinds of diversity that were intended by this initiative is important. I think if we take out the specific examples of the diversity we're talking about, then you leave yourself open to diversity such as farmers versus urban, or you have students versus people who have PhDs. I mean, there's a whole, when you don't characterize the kind of diversity you're talking about, you really leave yourself open to having so much diversity as to have no consistency applied, I think. So I'm inclined to leave it in. I mean, for one thing which I think is interesting in its omission, given the state of California politics and society, is there was no reference to sexual preference, which in an awful lot of our diversity language shows up. But anyway, because I think that it's helpful to the selection process to characterize the kind of diversity that we're talking about, I'm inclined to leave it in.
But you make the point. You just make my point, Commissioner Forbes, which is, why don't we have farmers in there? Why? It's because you're providing preference for race, ethnicity, geography, and gender. See, otherwise, why wouldn't you put farmers in there? Why wouldn't you put urban people? Why wouldn't you identify every aspect of diversity? Why not? Because they want to provide examples where preference is going to prevail. Preference for these items, which is what I precisely agree with the Connerly lawsuit, is illegal and unconstitutional. But that's my personal point.
Commissioner Rea.
Two things. Obviously, I don't think there's any question in anybody's mind that I favored the language. But, last night we heard from Mr. Salivary that the commission does not reflect economic diversity. So should we be adding in other considerations? I don't see this as favoring. I see it as simply giving some direction to the people of California as to what factors are diverse, because unfortunately there are a lot of people in this state who simply do not see that. They don't recognize that being from a different place, having a different ethnic background, gender, whatever other factors you want to throw in, all of those things do have an impact. And we sat through some hearings where people really tried to tell us that it was unpatriotic to consider having any sense of identity other than being an American. So I think it's a lot more complex in layers. I don't think it's a preference. I think it's just instructive, and I think it's useful for that purpose.
All right. In the interest of time, let me have a show of hands as to how many people would want to change the language, how many people that do not want to change the language. Again, keep in mind this is not the only opportunity that we have in making proposals to do a statutory amendment. or in other words, changes to it. This is just so that we can put together the initial list. If there's an overwhelming situation one way or the other, then we'll go with it as a first cut. And again, this is done strictly in the interest of time, and it is not my intent to limit your discussion on the topic. So how many would want to make the change to the language? Just raise your hand.
I'm on audio, and I don't have the video running, so I can't see how many people are raising their hands. But I would be...
Do you have your hand raised?
I have my hand raised. I think if I understand your question correctly, I would like to see amendment to this section.
All right, there are two hands. How many would not like
the
this?
other person who raised their hand?
Michael Ward.
Okay.
How many would not want to see it change? Not counting myself, there are 8 votes. So let's leave it alone for the time being. And again, this is not deciding that we're not going to make the language change. It's just that for the first cut, we're not going to include it. That's all we're doing at this point in time.
I might point out that besides yourself and Mike Ward, who voted against, everybody else was moved to or voted to keep the language.
It's not a formal vote. Just a go ahead.
I think if there is further consideration of this issue, then probably you're going to have to look at the application process, because we were all asked to provide do we identify in some way as a member of an ethnic or racial group. And so I think if there's that consideration, maybe that's another point that we're going to have to look at.
All right. It is 12:30. We can take a very short break for lunch and come back and continue this agenda topic, or else we can basically come back, address the business topics, and then come back and finish up this statutory amendment. What is the Commission's preference in terms of the order of addressing today's agenda?
Well, one suggestion I have is that, knowing that some of our partners were here who may have comments, at least on this first section, we might want to at least hit on dependent care reimbursement, if not before lunch, immediately after lunch, in case they have comments on that or other immediately preceding issues.
All right, let's complete the dependent care reimbursement before we break them.
Well, along those lines, I do think there are a couple of the partners that are here that gave some additional comments last night. So it's not just the dependent care. There are some new ones too.
Let's go as far as we can.
Okay.
And identify the proper point to break them. So, all right, dependent care reimbursement.
Well, I think we did leave Culver City undecided, and it's interesting, Mr. Salavery's comments last night. I think that one of the criticisms we've faced as a commission, and that we've even admitted ourselves, is that an area which we've not managed to reflect as good of diversity as the state is around class, around age, occupations, education. And I think that this area regarding dependent care reimbursement is an area where we have some opportunity to give the next commission a leg up towards being closer on that spectrum than we were. With the scale of income disparities that we see in our state, I personally feel, and I don't know how many would agree with me, that you can pay someone $300 a day to serve on a commission. It doesn't level the playing field between someone who makes, $30,000 a year and someone who makes $200,000 a year. It just doesn't, and particularly if that person in the lower bracket has 4 kids, 6 kids, and you're looking at dependent care for those kids or for other people in their family. So this is something I have definitely been thinking about. I have been, wondering And I think that's true no matter whether you give them the FSA or not, because at the end of the day, you're still, much more limited on how much income do you actually have to put into that FSA to begin with. I have been wondering whether one approach could be for us to include in the statutory language some language that dependent care is an expense that would be considered a business expense, but to allow it to the purview of the incoming commission to define from a policy perspective how that's applied. And I think of, for example, per diem was an area in which we did that. We knew the rate was going to be $300 a day, but then we had to come up with our own way of calculating, well, when do you reach $300 a day? And the reason that I feel like it is important for us to make some movement on this is that by the time the next commission would think about this, their commissioners would already be seated, and we wouldn't want it to impact what I think is the most crucial part of the process, which is the application pool, and just not even have those people even be up for consideration because they think that it's just not even attainable for them. So I personally felt like I was inclined to include something. I hadn't gone to the level of specificity necessarily of some of the other areas, but I do think in line with the criticisms that we've gotten from both sides of the political spectrum regarding our diversity, particularly around economic issues, I think it's something that the Commission should take up.
Any additional thoughts on the topic? All right, again,
I just wanted to add one point, and I was thinking about this last night after something that Ms. Gould had mentioned, was because there's this issue, too, of I've struggled with this too. It's a very big can of worms to kind of open up a dependent care reimbursement. It really, on very many levels, even though I highly recognize how much it's going to limit the people who are going to apply. But I also think there's a level of honesty that we need to let the next commission know what's required. And part of that is to say, for us to try and make it an easy road to apply by maybe trying to reduce these barriers of dependent care. But there's also a level, in fact, I went home and was talking to my husband saying, if I had to be honest with someone who wanted to apply, who had kids, who had small kids, or maybe was taking care of an elderly parent, it's, even if you got your expenses reimbursed, it's a huge amount of work. And it may not be quite so much for the next time because it may not be the same situation, but unless you have a support system, because you can't pay for enough daycare to make up for the time that you're going to be gone. And so I think to some degree, if you're making the road too easy, but if you're reducing so many of those barriers that you do get people that apply and they get in a situation because we've said, you can do it, we have to be honest to say, you can do it, but there's some big costs and there's some big responsibilities you have to have with support systems to make it work. So it's my little soapbox, but I'm still sitting here trying to decide how we can balance making that an easier transition for applications with the reality that there are just some barriers that we can't address too, and we should be honest with the next commission about that.
Commissioner Forbes?
Well, I think we cannot have language that applies just to us. And I think if there's going to be discussion about this with the legislative staff, it has to be a different kind of bill away from our statutory stuff. And it should be a rule that applies to all commissions, not just us. I think it's that kind of a policy change. The thing that troubles me the most is that there are many, many barriers to people applying. I look around the room here, and we're either retired, we work for the government, or we're basically in a position, we own our own business, and we're basically in a position to give ourselves time off. Are we going to have a thing that says, like you do for the military, no one, you don't lose your job because you're a private sector employee, because you have to serve on the commission, or are you, if you have an opportunity cost? I think Mike. Every time he's here, he's not doing what he does, so there's an opportunity cost to him. And there's many other professions like that. And so that provides a barrier to being on the commission. If you're an auto mechanic, we're here, Mr. Salavari wants a plumber. Well, if you're a plumber, you're not plumbing when you're here. and that's just an opportunity cost. And so I think that if you had, I'm not sure this is the one item I would pick out to make it easier for other people to apply. I think the comment that we need to be honest about what this entails and the opportunities of what it entails are important. But I frankly personally am disinclined to choose this one item out of all the other opportunity costs that are barriers to a variety of people to apply for the commission.
All right. Again, my shortcut is to kind of test the commission as to whether we do or don't want to move forward. I sort of walk away with our past discussion with undecided but inclined to include as compared to what you had put on paper, but inclined not to include. So I had a different impression. Mm-hmm. But in any case, let's have a see if we can achieve a majority in terms of whether we do or don't want to include this as a first cut this amendment change topics. Let's Commissioner Anti.
Let me ask a question of Commissioner Forbes. You're opposed to the single item as a statutory requirement. Is there broader language then that you would consider?
No, I think because I think there's so many potential things you could include as a barrier. I mean, if it's your test, is this a barrier? Does this make one less inclined to apply rather than more inclined to apply? And I think there's just so many different situations like that that are very unique, very individual, and I think you just simply can't put that into a statute. I think that like many civic obligations that people take, there's just a cost that you have to assume to apply for that position, and I think this is just one of them.
I think we have to acknowledge if this is the path we're going down, which of course I respect the will of the commission, is that this will have an impact on our ability to have considerations of particularly working class families, but potentially middle class families with young children that are willing to serve on this commission. And as we've seen as we traveled through the state, that is a demographic of the state that does have a lot of issues and thoughts and hopes around their political representation, and I think it's really a missed opportunity on our part.
All right. Let's.
Yeah, I understand what Commissioner Forbes is saying, but I think, so first of all, I think we need to at some point have a serious conversation about the barriers for serving on the commission, period. I mean, and that could be anything from how we're going to encourage in our policy manual more teleconferencing. I mean, all kinds of things that might make it more friendly for people to come to meetings, that they could do it long distance. I mean, I think we should really, really look at that closely, because there are a series of barriers for a lot of people. This is a very, we could end up like those juries where it's people that basically have time on their hands, or they're professionals that can call the shots, as you described. I think the issue of the dependent care is a little different. I think of it as also something that we just haven't, that we should think about in reimbursement terms. In other words, it's not just an issue of how to attract folks to take the time, but that really there are expenses associated with that set of people who serve that they can't get reimbursed for it, right? They're willing to serve, but the reimbursement for the child care basically means that their $300 a day per diem is nullified, because it all goes. So they're really serving in some ways for free. I know it might seem like a small distinction, but I do think that it might get into more like the reimbursement policies. And then we should think in a bigger way about how we make sure we have a commission where a lot of people from different walks of life can serve.
Commissioner Forbes.
Thank you, Peter. I think that, I mean, I can understand the reimbursement issue, and maybe that there's language around that. But for example, every time I'm here, almost, I have to hire somebody else. So, you know, am I supposed to be reimbursed for that? Or I have to go hire, if I can't, if I'm here and I have to hire somebody else to prune my trees. Do I get reimbursed for that? I mean, so I think that, I mean, I hate to use the phrase slippery slope, but I mean, so, you know, perhaps there's some language that any legitimate expense, you know, or any expense you incur to be here, that gets it's a reimbursable expense. Maybe there's some broad language like that. That, you know, I'm more open to that because that does apply to everybody. Everybody who would be on the commission. But, you know, whether that language can be crafted in a good way, I don't know the answer.
I'm inclined to agree with Commissioner Forbes very much on that because I think, and I've mentioned this before, that there are people that lose business or maybe have to lose some of their income to be here. And so that's an expense that they're taking on. They're losing income and I'm expending income by having to pay for daycare. It's the same thing. It's a loss of income. So I wouldn't want just the dependent care reimbursements to be the only one that gets the benefit. I'd like to see something of more equality.
I'm not in favor of a statutory amendment, but I would like to see us emphasize this when we start talking about our policy as an issue, maybe somewhere in the selection process, but also as an issue for the next commission to look at in terms of perhaps finding other resources beyond the commission, beyond, you know, having to get it in this budget. Whether there would be anyone else who might be willing to fund that sort of thing to allow families to serve.
Commissioner Gary.
We're going to be here all afternoon. Just that, you know, that I'm in support of Connie's, you know, analysis and argument that essentially, you know, her suggestion is that we include it and leave it up to the next commission to apply it however they would like. So I will tell you that the issue of child care was a consideration that I had to make because I have a granddaughter that I help take care of, and you know, and so I'm particularly sensitive to that fact. There's women that I know that are very involved that have children at the local level. However, once you leave the local level, especially in the county level, their involvement is not as great simply because of child care issues. So it is, and we can talk about all these categories that perhaps should be considered and go, you know, on and on. But I think that my particular feeling about Connie's recommendation is that, you know, we're essentially writing it down, documenting the fact that we recognize that issue, which we did. And at one time, even we're going to pool our money as commissioners to help the two mothers on the commission, and you know, and they said no, you know, we don't want to go there, you know. However, that was a need that we felt was impacting these two mothers, and so this would document that fact. And but again, we're also leaving it up to the commission to do with it whatever they would like. So, also that perhaps it would encourage the applicant pool of mothers and others with dependent children to throw their hat in the ring, so to speak. Absent this, it might continue to chill out and continue to be a barrier to participation.
Commissioner Parvati.
Following Dr. Commissioner Aguirre is never a very easy task. But I concur. This is definitely a serious consideration. My concern also is that for the next commission, we happen to have two exceptional commissioners with Commissioner DeGiulio and Galambos Maloya, who went above and beyond the call of duty to not only maintain their livelihoods and jobs and also raise a family. And I'm inclined to have us consider this as a very strong policy consideration or recommendation, so that we go on record, so the other commission can build in a certain mechanism. I don't know how to define that mechanism at this point, but it certainly needs to be noted and duly noted that this is a concern and an exceptional concern. And I agree with Commissioner Forbes, we've all taken quantitative and qualitative losses in this process. I've lost vacation time on my job and promotional opportunities and other things. And to define how we definitely lose ground. Commissioner Ward's case, as was mentioned before, and others, I can go around this table, and there may be specific or non-specific ways that we've sacrificed. But for the record, I'm inclined to agree with Commissioner Galambos Maloya that this is a serious consideration, and there should be some type of monetary gain or compensation for this unique and extreme and exceptional effort. Again, we happen to have been very fortunate this go-round to have two exceptional commissioners who've done a great job on the commission and also maintained a home. And I'm concerned about the quality and the effectiveness of the next commissioners who may be selected for this responsibility. Will they be able to maintain? We don't know. Will they be able to maintain that same level of commitment and dedication to this service?
Commissioner Ward.
Just to, I guess, follow that up, and it's on. Just like my vote, I guess, regarding diversity, it's bigger than the 4 listed categories in California. Diversity is huge. Barriers to serving on the commission are huge, as we've obviously spelled out here. Unfortunately, some of those barriers just don't allow everybody to be in a life position to enter public service. Part of the recruiting and application process is, I know at least I was asked on at least 2 occasions, is there anything that would prevent you from being able to serve and things like that? Now, I know none of us knew what we were getting into when we started with this, but ultimately, at the end of the day, there is always going to be a segment, and I think that mothers particularly is a very important thing to have represented, but there's certainly mothers are mothers forever, so some are going to be in a position to be able to serve, some might not be, but I don't know if we should change the statute to accommodate just one or 2 barriers, as Mr. Forbes had said.
Peter, just one last comment. I do agree that the number one issue is to make sure that we have a spectrum of income diversity on the next commission. And if somehow we don't address this issue as a policy issue otherwise, it is very likely that the next commission will have very high income commissioners, all of them. There will be a tendency to drift towards, in the next 2 or 3 commissions, if that's not addressed, you're going to have a uniformity in high income levels on all of the commissioners.
All right, let me have a show of hands. How many interested in having statutory amendment to address the dependent care reimbursement? Show of hand. 1, 2.
Again, I can't see.
1, 2 to address the statutory change to address the amendment. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hands. Jody, is your hand up or down?
No, it's down.
Okay. How many does not want to make any changes to what we have in addressing the dependent care? The statute. Sorry. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
My hand is up as well.
7. All right, what's the commission's position? Want to continue the discussion? Want to? Go ahead.
What, I voted no, and I know it surprises some people because I was one of those people passing the hat to for the reimbursement. I'm don't want to do it yet to vote yes on the statutory. I want us to take a really hard look, just like we're taking a hard look at some of the dates and timelines. I want us to really think about how we get a more diverse group of people to serve on this commission. Income, jobs, geography, gender, family. I mean, there are only 2 people on this commission that have young children. That's a problem, in terms of the views that you bring to the table. But that's why I'm voting no now, because I want to have a broader discussion about what we do, even about the structure of meetings, technology, everything that we can think about how to enhance participation. So I'm holding out for that.
Okay. Again, today's decision is really not voting anything up or down. Today's decision is really, shall we include it as part of the topic to discuss with other governmental bodies in terms of a first list of things. If you vote against it, doesn't mean you're against it. It just simply means that we don't really want to start off with this as being on the list. So I don't think we have a clear majority to include it. So I'm kind of inclined not to put it on the list at this point in time. And there are ample opportunity to discuss it further and reach a different conclusion and put it back on. But or else we can take the time out to address this fully as to whether we do or don't want to put it on the list. So, Connie?
Well, what I did hear some interest in was exploring more holistically the various barriers to serving, which would include dependent care and potentially a number of other considerations. And my immediate concern is how do we wrap in and facilitate that in time that it can be considered for your process?
Well, can I suggest that another consideration is that this could be, I don't think this is going to be solved in a short time. I think this is a longer conversation, that this may be another statutory amendment as well, too. We don't have to do all of them at once. Mm-hmm. We don't have to do all of these things at once. And to be honest, I think this is also, it has a lot of repercussions for other commissions and other employees of the state, too. So I think that even if we were to move forward with this, it may be something that we have to tease out of other statutory recommendations. So maybe it would be beneficial if because I think there is agreement to move forward with this, with dependent care and the other barriers, but maybe we could consider that kind of a bigger beast to go after down the road.
So I had thought of the 3 categories roughly: the move forward right now, the we need to study it and explore it further, and then forget about it. So it sounds like this is not something we will be resolving in time for this legislative session, but that we could begin that process and potentially it'd be a second layer of bills or bill.
Well, I don't see it quite that conclusively. We have between now and April to add to it, subtract from it, and we have opportunity to discuss it further. This really is between now and maybe a week, 2 weeks, to give enough direction to the subcommittee to move forward with their discussion with the other parties. So I never intend for this session today to have a up or down vote on any single issue, and I'm hoping that that's not how you interpret as to what the votes mean. It's simply, shall we include that as part of our first draft? The term draft has been again misused previously, but again, what's the commission's preference in terms of how to get off this
The issue of
tie?
considering it with other issues that seem to have an effect on the overall character of the commission seems to be a reasonable thing to consider.
Commission and Chair?
No, I agree. And I voted no simply because it was framed as a statutory amendment. I don't know if this is appropriate. It may not be appropriate for. I don't think it is actually necessarily appropriate for statutory amendment, other than some broader sort of statement regarding reimbursements or compensation. I mean, we do have specific things like $300 or index to inflation, $300. I think that's a very specific thing that ought to be looked at as well if we're looking at sort of the package that ought to be provided to commissioners and how the barriers can be, as many barriers as possible can be removed given the realities of serving as a public official. But I certainly don't want to take it off the table entirely. I fully agree with other commissioners who think we ought to look at this as part of a package that who can actually serve, what's realistic, and what are the areas of diversity that, again, aren't currently in the statute, but I think ought to be considered. And economic or income diversity is one of them I think is important as well. But I don't want to just sort of curtail discussion of the issue. I think it ought to be framed as a part of a larger set of questions.
Could I make a suggestion that maybe if we wanted to consider this for discussion and potentially have it come back to the table for inclusion, maybe would Commissioner Columbus-Malloy, maybe Forbes, since he's not here, I could nominate him. Well, he had some ideas of some of the other barriers. Would you two like to work together maybe to identify some of those barriers, and if there are any potential solutions, and then we can discuss it later? Or Commissioner Raya has.
I was just going to say, I think we volunteered Commissioner Forbes for something else earlier this morning.
Don't.
So, or he volunteered.
That was language for that. That was language that we decided on the spot. So it's he's been released. He's free.
Okay. I'm happy to do that, and I'm wondering then we may just want to rename this category 10 to, I don't know. In my mind, I'm thinking of as barriers to entry, but that's probably not the right term. But something that allows us more flexibility on what that includes.
So we have achieved consensus not to include this as a statutory amendment going as the first, what do we call this, first draft, first try, best intent.
Has to be when it's the second year of the session.
All right. Other items we want to take up before the lunch break. There is consensus on eat. I'm sorry. All right. Yes. Let's have one last opportunity before lunch for the public to comment on everything that we have discussed.
Well, Ms. Gold is coming up. Let me just mention what Mr. Achero just said. This is another form of policy visualization.
Hi, again, Rosalind Gold with the Naleo Educational Fund. I just want to commend the Commission for really doing some hard thinking about the barriers to participation and service on the Commission. And as you're thinking of the issue, we would recommend that, yes, it is important to think about the implications for the action you take for other commissions or for other staff, but we don't believe you should shy away from recognizing the uniqueness of service on this commission, that the intensity, that the hours that are involved, the collapsed time period, this is a unique and exceptional type of commission, and we don't think it's inappropriate to decide that there might be policies that would apply to this commission that you would not need to apply to other commissions. Thank you.
30 minutes enough, or 45 minutes? 45 minutes, so we will reconvene at 1:45.
Cafeteria's open at 6. Oh, yeah. Regular business. Yeah, regular business.
It's 5-2. I like to continue the commission meeting. At this point, I want to get your input as to whether we stay on this agenda item and try to finish up. The speakers from yesterday came today in anticipation of our potential questions that we may have for them. Or we can go to the business meeting, take care of those items, and then come back to the statutory amendment topic. So what is this commission's preference?
Chairman, yeah, I would suggest that we put this aside and continue with the business items, and then possibly come back today or at a later date to address the remainder of the items on our list, unless there's somebody in the public that wants to talk about it.
I would emphasize the urgency of covering the items today. So,
I'm sorry?
I would emphasize the urgency of covering the rest of the items today so we can have a package.
All right.
Okay.
Any other inputs? All right, so let me open up the meeting by inviting the public to address this commission on all topics. Topics that are on the agenda, topic that are off the agenda. After the public comments, we're going to go into the business meeting, which would include a closed session. And when we finish the business meeting, then we'll come back and continue the discussion of the statutory amendment. So if there's anything the public would like to address the commission, please come forward. All right, seeing none, let's jump on to the finance administration discussion then. Mr. Claypool, I think.
Thank you. First of all, the status of the budget. We sent over a second request, as I said we would do in Culver City. That second request was for $3.6 million versus the $2.9 million that we had originally talked about sending, and that we did send. The $2.9 million was for pretty much a litigation commission cost through January 31st. The 3.6 was the estimate of what our litigation costs would be after January 1st through June 30th. And it was a surprise to both myself and to the Department of Finance that the $2.9 million really originally forecast by Morrison Forster was then projected to move us all the way through to the end of June because of how little litigation we had relative to what we had planned as a worst-case scenario. We're waiting for a response from the Department of Finance, but as we understand, that has been, we believe that has been shared with the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, and that will be taken up under an appropriation bill for this year. In the meantime, we have freed up enough funds to pay our attorneys through November 30th. And I'll ask Deborah to pass this out. And as you'll see from here, from about what you're about to receive, the bulk of the expense that came through November. And I think you can just pass those across, yeah. The bulk of the expense that came through November has now either been paid or has been invoiced and submitted for payment. So with Gibson done through January 15th, the remainder owed to them is only $39,000. Now that's going to increase because they have ongoing expenses, but yeah, I would say that we'll probably by the end of January have less than a $50,000 balance owed to them. The Morrison Forrester at $158 remaining is more problematic in that it does not include the expense of the Supreme Court activity in January. Nevertheless, I would not anticipate that they would be more than $250,000. So right now, this commission's outstanding bills with its attorneys are at about $300,000 to $325,000. We also have funds remaining that will take your staff as well as your costs through the end of February. And after that, I believe that do we have any further? After that, Deborah will be able to tell me whether we.
After that, we're going to be waiting for the additional funds.
So we're going to be relying on the appropriation. So, and this is all as we had planned. And so when we receive the 3.6 or whatever is appropriated to us, then we'll continue to operate through June 30th. That's our current kind of the state of the commission. We also, this coming week on the 10th, plan on submitting your spring finance letter. As you know, in the fall, Commissioner Yao had asked me about this, and so a very brief explanation. In the fall, we had started on the budget process, and we had gotten to the point where we were going to submit a preliminary budget to the Department of Finance based on what we thought was coming ahead. At kind of the 11th hour, we were asked by the staff people that basically handle us through the Department of Finance and General Government to not submit that budget because it was too contingent. There was no way of knowing what basis there was, and at that time they didn't want to tie up general fund money in the budget and then have to reduce it. Their instructions to us were to wait until the spring finance letter when we had a better idea of what we were going to be doing, and then submit our budget to them at that time. It was actually fairly sound advice because we've come across now and we have a much better idea of what next year looks like. What I have asked Deborah and Joe, who I'll be introducing here in just a second, to do is to put together a budget that encompasses this statutory amendment process through August, which is the end of the, if we get the bill, that's when it occurs, and to allow for staffing, to go to our attorneys and ask for their kind of crystal ball view of what the worst case scenario for next year would be, and then we're going to submit that to the Department of Finance as your budget for 12-13. One of the things that we're going to incorporate into that is a reduction of staff down to what we've called our smallest footprint, and we're working on that right now. I had said recently that would be approximately 4 full-time equivalent staff split across 6 people. 4 would be retired annuitants at halftime who have very specialized skill, and then 2 would be permanent staff. We're also going to include in that our estimation of any surcharge that might be charged to this commission by an agency that might absorb you. And we're still looking into that possibility, that perhaps the Department of General Services or some agency would be willing to do that. Yesterday, we received a letter from the Department of Finance, and it went out to all budget officers. I'm looking for it right here. And in it, it says, this email provides instructions and guidance for identifying the total inventory of boards, commissions, offices, committees, task force, authorities, advisory panels, and councils, as well as identification of those boards and commissions that no longer have significant value and should be considered for elimination. There are nearly 300 boards and commissions in existence as identified by the Legislative Analyst's Office inventory in June 2011. And now we would like you to start identifying yourselves and what you do. In it are questions like the number of board and commission members, current annual salaries, evaluate the original purpose for establishing you, is the purpose or function similar or duplicative to other boards, on and on. We are going to be filling that out through the chair and the vice chair and working on our response to them. But part of this may be a resolution to find a board or commission that you might be able to share staff with. I mean, there's a possibility here. Again, this commission has always asked for a way to get smaller and to conserve as much as possible, and this might be the vehicle for it. We continue to do that. That will be the emphasis of the 12-13 budget, and what I imagine you will see is a budget that was very similar to the one you received out of our spring finance letter last year, and that will be a certain amount for the operation of this commission, and then a certain amount in either a provisional fund for litigation, or possibly we could end up with a litigation contingency fund rather than the revolving account that we had talked about that just holds a certain amount of money in place for you contingent against litigation. So that's what, and by the way, the spring finance letters due on the 10th to the Department of Finance by staff, and that's not an official date. That's the time that our principal program manager would like to see what our plan is so that we can start working on refining it. Are there any questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
On the invoices for the attorneys, the ongoing expenses, do those have to do with contracted services that they, because I have a further question about whatever happened to all the stuff we sent to be scanned and saved and returned to us, because we paid for all that service, right? And I, every now and again, I look around my office and I see a big space there, and so I think about it. Where is my stuff?
Everything up to November includes their consultants. This would include Q2's work, is included in here, the firm that did the actual gathering of the data and so forth. So they should, once these are paid, because these are the invoices submitted for payment. The payment hasn't been made yet, but it's now in the hands of the Department of General Services and State Controller's Office. Having said that, if you have something that needs to be returned, you need to ask for that through Christina. There are several things I've asked to be returned. Now, I don't know if your stuff is being held hostage until we pay them, or
well, my understanding, weren't we going to get all that discovery stuff returned to us? That's what I understood. Everything that was given that the attorneys requested us to submit for potential discovery, that it was going to be scanned, and then the originals or whatever we had sent would be returned.
I believe that's the way it's supposed to work.
Okay, so could we find out?
We will.
I mean, I guess we can live without that stuff, but it is your own personal record of your participation on the commission.
It needs to be returned.
Thank you.
And we will pursue that.
Thank you.
What did Kirk used to say? With alacrity. Are there process-wise any questions, Commissioner?
Well, so just going back to payments, so the remainder is $39,000, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was there any interest payments we had to pay?
Sorry, here.
No. We certainly weren't made aware of an interest payment. It was just straight invoice, and I think we just paid it. Okay. And we held it and paid it. Okay. Okay, so still working on it. I got cleared everything in the status of the budget. Management of personnel. The first thing I would like to say is that we are, at the end of this month, really one of the finest additions that we had on the job. And we are very fortunate, however, to be filling behind Deborah at a good time. Joseph Alameda. Joe, if you come up. And typically we would ask.
No, stay there.
Okay.
We're not done.
We're not done with you.
All right. Joe, I'm going to ask Joe just to give a little presentation on what he has done in life.
I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for your consideration of the budget officer position. And I look forward to providing support and financial advice to the executive director and to the commission. I retired in 2005 after 31 years of state service. The last 10 years of my state service, I performed as the deputy director for the California State Summer School for the Arts. As deputy director, I was responsible for all the administrative aspects of the summer school, which included budgets, human resources, accounting, and contracts. Prior to that, I spent 16 years as the administrative director of the California Arts Council and performing all of the administrative functions and including grants to arts organizations and individuals. So that's 21 years of my state service. I started out in this building actually right out of college in the Assembly Chief Clerk's office and engrossing and enrolling, so I haven't been back here for a while. But
and originally you're from Hawaii, from Kailua.
Kailua, Oahu, Hawaii.
Yeah. Aloha kaua. So how do you spell your last name?
It's Alameida.
You must have not talked to Deborah. Deborah probably would have warned you about this commission.
She tried to. I was not seeking to come back to work. I was happy enjoying retirement, enjoying my grandsons, and enjoying afternoon naps. But I'm happy to be here, and it's interesting. I have followed the commission's work from the beginning and through the news organizations, and found it very interesting.
Well, thank you. Welcome. Welcome. Yes. Deborah, on behalf of the Finance Administration Subcommittee, who has worked with you very closely and worked with you from the days that we were somewhat in the dark to having you showing us the light, and we certainly appreciate what you have done for us and put up with all our unreasonable requests along the way, and I think the data that you have presented to us is fantastic, not only in numerical forms but also in pictorial forms that made the job of understanding the budget a lot more tolerable. So you've been an exceptional service to us, and on behalf of the Commission, I want to thank you. Thank you very much.
Sure, y'all. This time has sure come quick. I mean, it'll be a year for me in March, which I won't make. The end of this month, I'll probably be done with my hours. And as I come to a close, I appreciate working with everyone and how we came together as a team, and the fact that we even did this thing is still an amazing thing. I want to thank Dan with his leadership back at the ranch and keeping us all connected here. I've really appreciated it a lot, as well as the team back at the office, the ones who've not passed on, but who's already left the employment of the commission. I'm really excited about Joe coming on board, and there being a slight overlap in time so that we can kind of transition as much as possible over the next few weeks. So thanks again. And I'll be here another few weeks, but this is probably the last time that we'll be together, so I wanted to make sure to come and say goodbye.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, right.
I have to say this commission keeps getting very, very lucky with the retired annuitant pool that's been available to you. It's been extraordinary, the level of talent that we've been able to pull into these positions, both to the left and to right, and so hopefully we'll continue to be that lucky. Which brings me to something that I think that the commission needs to consider. I think all of you got this short language here. Because we are meeting less and less as a full body, and I know that we could go through and continue to vote on staff individually, what we would like to do is put this into the form of an amendment, actually amendment, and put this in the form of a vote to change our guidelines so that for the changes in actual budgetary positions, that this can be accomplished by simply going through the chair and the vice chair and bringing on people like Joe when we lose folks because of hours. This wouldn't certainly, I don't believe any of you as a chair or vice chair would not take something like a firing or something or a major hire back to the commission, and you should be involved with those. But for the day-to-day operations where this comes up, this will eliminate our need to use a personal services contract to bring somebody aboard and then transition them into a position with the commission as a retired annuitant.
First of all, I don't know whether this short paragraph is available on the website or not. If not, could you read it in its entirety?
We are saying, with the approval of the chair and vice chair, the executive director is authorized to take necessary steps to modify staffing in order to conform to the commission's budgetary decisions. This authority includes the ability to lay off staff as required by the budget.
Thank you. The situation is the commission is required to approve hiring and quote-unquote firing of staff, and because of the frequency that we meet, it's getting tougher and tougher to handle these type of situation in real time. So the proposal is to formally give the authority to the executive director to handle that for the commission, obviously with the chair and vice chair's approval. So if you concur with this, then I think we can adhere closer to the budget plan as compared to having to adjust this layoff situation based on our availability to meet. So that's really the full intent of this proposal that's before us.
Chairman, do you require a motion on this? If so,
Yes.
I'd be happy to make the motion that we approve this policy. Shall we call it a policy?
Second.
All right. Any further discussions on this topic? All right. At this point, I would open it up to the public. Again, we're making a motion here to modify the requirement of having the entire staff approving the hiring and firing of staff to delegated authority to the chair, the vice chair, and the executive director to make these type of decisions so that they can be made in a more timely manner as compared to having to fully adhere to the words of the latest guideline or to the guideline. I should say it that way. All right, seeing no one else coming up to the podium, let's take a voice vote on this. Let's take a roll call on this. I'm sorry.
Commissioner Aguirre?
Yes.
Commissioner Anchetta?
Yes.
Commissioner Baraba?
Yes.
Commissioner Blanco?
Yes.
Commissioner Dye? Commissioner DeGiulio?
Yes.
Commissioner Filkins-Weber?
No.
Commissioner Forbes?
Yes.
Commissioner Galamos-Malloy?
Yes.
Commissioner Antai?
Yes.
Commissioner Parvenu?
Yes.
Commissioner Raya?
Yes.
Commissioner Ward? Commissioner Yao?
Yes.
Motion passes. Okay. There's some lag time there.
All right. Any additional item under the finance administration topic?
There is one other item I'd like to propose to the commission. We had originally planned on Lon's last day with the commission. Part of this was to be the end of February. However, we have since then, since we had done that budgetary consideration, added one more meeting that will occur in March. And Lon is the one who is primarily involved with scheduling those. We have not filled a position behind Brian Burns in kind of our basic accounting, so that there is funding available to allow for one more month of his employment to take care of this particular function and to just make sure that it runs as smoothly as all your meetings have. It will be our last public meeting like that for some time or in the foreseeable future. So I would propose to this commission that we extend one more month of employment to Lon if it meets your approval.
Any thoughts on this topic? Yes. Someone shut off the...
I just had a question. So the one in March is the one when we're bringing back the amendments. That's the one you're referring to.
Exactly. It's the one we refer to as the Forbes meeting, because he was the one who actually
Sunshine
proposed.
Forbes, yeah.
If you look at the timeline that we handed out, we're looking at around March 15th, but we haven't planned it yet. But expect it in that latter half of March. Closer to the 15th, the better if we're going to stay on track.
Beware the eyes of March.
All right. Really seeing no objection to this, and also exercising the amendment that we just passed, I think between the chair and the vice chair and the executive director, I think we can make that decision. So without having to go through a roll call. All right. So next topic, please.
Okay, we are into communications for the statutory amendment process. I don't know if we actually have.
As usual, I will defer to Mr. Wilcox.
Deborah, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Deborah.
Bye-bye.
Good afternoon. So, a few things. Number one, of course, disseminating timely information to the public, as with Commissioner DiGiulio's flow chart, and having that up and letting the public know that it's there, and also sending out other releases that we've been sending out on the statutory amendment guides, and then as you're narrowing down your focus, getting that information out there to the partners, to our extensive list of those who have opted in and want to know what's going on, and to the media as well. And as this process moves on, and there will be changes, that needs to be a very robust, communication to make sure that those that are interested are kept informed. Also, there will, as we've seen with the Supreme Court decision and other things, that we've had timely messages and communications, and I'll work with the commissioners as you're going out and speaking, and that you may be receiving now as we're going into the election cycle. There will be more forums in localities, especially with the League of Women Voters, educating on the new districts and other issues, and that we will be updating our talking points to reflect the things that have happened most recently, and that we will, and working with the Public Information Advisory lead, that we will be putting together very clear information that the public can access right on the front page about the facts, and the facts of what the state Supreme Court has said about these maps, what the Justice Department with the pre-clearance, what the facts are of why this process was different and better than the one before. So those are the messages and challenges before us.
Does anyone have any questions about what we've done so far, or what you see, what you think we should be planning for going forward? Because we have our own little conversations, but I think it's good to hear from you.
Commissioner in chair.
Again, obviously, we're anticipating should the referendum qualify for, or the process qualify for the ballot. I mean, do you anticipate that commissioners will play an active role in terms of informational roles for us? I know we're not campaigning, but there is clearly a need for broader dissemination of information about the commission's work and the maps, not pro or con on the actual referendum. But given that, do you anticipate the commissioners playing a more significant role?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We do. We are working on crafting, speaking, talking points that would be of help to the commissioners to stay within the constrictions on us. Any other questions?
Clearly, I think we've all made ourselves available where there have been specific requests that have been directed to us by our communications director. I wonder, at this point in time, does that continue to be our approach? Should we as commissioners be actively looking for opportunities to spread information about the work we did, or just trying to get a sense of the flow?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think also I'm very open, and as commissioners have brought opportunities, and you've all been good about running it through, and that we work on talking points and those kinds of things. And I think absolutely that I encourage everyone, and as I do too, in reaching out to partners and other groups to look for those kinds of speaking engagements, because I think that's very important in continuing to get the message. And the message is very simple when you're talking about, if you're asked about the referendum, because you can always talk about the facts, and we can put those together in very strong talking points.
Thank you. Technical Subcommittee.
Well, I think most of the issues that we're kind of in the process of discussing, and I guess we'll come back to, we've been talking about, we'll get to the summary of the presentations from last night. Then if we have time and we'd like to go, the commissioner statutory amendment suggestions, though I think some of it's duplicate from what we've already been talking about. I think maybe the only thing that's not here is the process for compiling CRC suggestions to the legislative staff by the 15th of February. I'm assuming, Dan, that's the target that we're on for compiling things from this meeting. Is that correct?
It is, and we sprung this on Commissioners Aguirre and DiGiulio by putting this in here, and they're doing quite well. But to stay on track for what we've got on this timeline, we really need to work closely with them and staff and to make sure that we pull this together and can get it to the Bureau of State Audits and the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State's position is going to be fairly limited to that one question. And so once we get that back, we can get this bill done by the time we're supposed to.
So is your idea then to we'll come away with today some of the ideas for the statutory amendment, we'll write them up, and then we're going to send them to BSA and SOS right away, and then they'll come back from them by the 15th?
No, I was thinking more in terms that we would work with you to compile the decisions or recommendations out of this, that we would then send them back out to the commission to see them. I think when you see them in their totality, then it's more important. Put that on a very short turnaround, and then when we get it back, we'll put it in the format that you want, and and we'll run it by the chair and the vice chair, and then it'll go out to CRC and SOS, and then we'll ask them for maybe I'm thinking maybe a 10-day turnaround to get back to us.
And then, and what deadline is that? Because if we need to get all of that done before the 15th of legislative staff, that gives us 13 days. 10 days.
Well, it's
I'm just doing the calculations here.
So right here we're on the 1st, and so we would try to select and approve the amendments to move forward in this week. We would send it back out to the commission for a quick look. We would go ahead and get permission from the chair and vice chair by the 15th to send it to the BSA. Then we get it back from the BSA. I said 10 days, but we're looking at a week. Ask them for a week turnaround. Then we bring it back, and by March 1st, we're looking for to reapprove the amendments that are going to move forward.
Okay.
And in this time, I believe the legislative staff is amenable to making themselves available to make sure that we stay on track.
Okay, I see that. So you're looking at the deadline. I was looking at the you had on our agenda on under C it said suggestions to the legislative staff by Wednesday, February 15th. So I was just a little concerned about that tight deadline. But I see based on your timeline, you're actually thinking that day would be more like March 1st.
It is, and also when I said process for compiling CRC suggestions to legislative, more of an update by the 15th of where we're at in the process and keeping them apprised of our progress.
Okay. Then I think everything else, unless Commissioner Geary has some comments, I think everything else is just to finish up some of our discussion that we've been having about potential statutory amendments.
Just to mention that we asked about the governor's involvement in this, and that the word was that we would prefer, and the legislative staffers would prefer that the governor's office get involved sooner rather than later. So we're going to bring them into the loop as soon as we have something available and we start meeting with them.
So our next telephone conference will likely to be on or about the 9th, which is next Thursday. We probably won't get the committee involved with the statutory amendment topic during that period unless there are specific items that we want to continue to discuss. For example, the child care issue. That's just an example, not a proposed topic at this point in time. But in terms of talking about the overall statutory amendment, we'll get a briefing from you on the overall update, but there won't be any discussion in the next meeting. Is that the correct interpretation?
I think at the very least you'd get an update. If something had happened and we got feedback from BSA or SOS and we needed to make some revisions, we could talk about it. I just keep it open as a discussion. Who knows what will happen? Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I'm just trying to anticipate as to what's going to happen. And then the 15 is on or about the 15 is when you submit it to the legislative staff, right? Which is.
No, let me look at this because I should have done a better job of linking them up. We're actually looking about moving the. We will be talking with them, but moving the proposed amendments to the legislative staff for review after the 1st of March in that first week.
All right, so beyond the 9th, we have a couple more weeks when we can agendize and discuss this in greater detail as necessary.
We do, and we have we've agendized every Wednesday and Thursday for just about forever right now. So we always have those dates available to us.
I know they're available just in case, but as far as planning for the balance of the month.
Right. The only reason I mentioned that was because I don't know if the 9th works specifically for everyone, so we do also have the 8th.
Right.
Are those morning or afternoon?
Usually 3 to 6, sometime in that order. But that's not hard and firm. It's just the way we've been doing it. So, by the way, if there are other times that are more convenient to everybody, Jeannie is going to be our next chair, so please send the email to her.
There you go.
Okay, anything else under the technical discussion topic? No? Legal advisory discussion topics.
We've handed out, and Lon, can you hand these out? I just-